Can I tell you what's been stuck in my head all week? I've been back reading in Luke chapter 13, reading about the woman who had been bent over for 18 years. I've read her story I don't know how many times, and I've even taught on this passage before. But this week, I just can't get past this one little detail. We don't even know her name. Hey guys, I'm really glad that you're here. You know, it's actually been a few weeks since the last episode. When I started this podcast, I really did have every intention of putting out one every single week. The second week would have been Reese Fest, and so obviously I wasn't going to do one that day. And I had every intention of doing one the next Saturday after Reese Fest. That was supposed to be episode 2, but I'll be honest, I was just exhausted. And I decided I'd skip a week because I figured everybody would understand. I put a lot of thought into episode 2. I had already had that next episode planned. I had studied, I had been writing. I thought I knew exactly where we were headed. But during Reese Fest, I had the opportunity to spend some time talking with some ladies from Christ Way Ministries. And if you're not familiar with Christ Way Ministries, it's a ministry that walks alongside women recovering from addiction. And some of these women shared pieces of their stories with me. And I left that conversation just thinking about them and praying for them. And as I was standing there talking to them, and especially over the next several days, Luke 13 would just not leave me alone. I sat down to work on the message for episode 2 that I had planned out, and God just kept showing me Luke 13. And then a couple of days later, I was driving down the road and a song played and it reminded me of Luke 13. And then I was folding laundry, and I fold laundry on my kitchen table. So I was watching a lady give a message on TV, and she wasn't talking on Luke 13, but it just made me think Luke 13. And so finally I just said, like, I felt like God was just saying, you have to do Luke 13. And so finally I said, okay, Lord, are you sure? Because I had already spoken on this passage before. And I don't want to be repetitive, you know. Last fall, I had the opportunity to speak at a women's conference, and I spent, since it was my first speaking engagement, I spent 4 months in Luke 13, reading commentaries. I would look up the Greek, cross-reference other passages. I really thought that I was finished with it. I thought that I had said everything about Luke 13 that needed to be said. And like I said, I don't want to be repetitive and talk about something here that I've already talked about before. But I finally opened my Bible back to Luke 13 anyways. And what surprised me wasn't that I found something new. It was that I found a completely different message than the one that I had talked about before. When I read this passage last fall, I think that Luke 13 is about the bent over woman, and I think that I saw myself in this woman. Grief, depression, anxiety, guilt, the weight after Reese had passed away is really what I was talking about, like what my life was like then and how I saw myself in her and related to her, because that was the lens that I had been reading through my story. But this time something dawned on me. And as I was reading it, I realized that I didn't even know her name. I have read this story countless times, yet somehow I'd never really paused there before. Luke never tells us her name. For 18 years, she's just simply the bent over woman. Well, for 2,000 years, she's simply the bent over woman. That's how he introduces her, not by her name, but by her condition. And I wondered, what did she see herself? I wondered if she's seen herself that way too. If she only looked at herself and saw the bent over woman. And I wondered how many of us have done that to ourselves as well. Do we start to believe that we are our struggles? We are our grief, our anxiety, our shame, or even our addiction? Do we let what we're carrying define who we are? And that's what I couldn't shake about this story. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Because while everybody else saw a bent over woman, you'll find out that Jesus saw a daughter. And I have a feeling that we have something that we can learn from her. So I'm going to read from Luke chapter 13. If you have your Bible, you're welcome to open and read along. You might be listening to this in the car or while folding laundry or whatever. So let's just see where this goes. I'm going to start at verse 10. And he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, he as in Jesus. And there was a woman who for 18 years had had a sickness caused by a spirit, and she was bent double and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said to her, "Woman, you are freed from your sickness." And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made erect again and began glorifying God. But the synagogue officials, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, began saying to the crowd in response, "There are 6 days in which work should be done. So come during them and get healed, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the stall and lead him to water him? And this woman, a daughter of Abraham as she is, whom Satan has bound for 18 long years, should not have been released from this bond on the Sabbath day?" As he said this, all of his opponents were being humiliated, and the entire crowd was rejoicing over all of the glorious things being done by him. So, before we go on, there's something cool about Luke and the way that he tells stories. And this story, especially, because this story only shows up in Luke's gospel. You're not going to see it in Matthew, Mark, or John, just Luke. And maybe it's because Luke was a physician, or maybe that's just how God wired him. But something that I've noticed from reading Luke is that Luke really noticed the details. And I like that because I'm a detailed person. Like, I like to know the details about everything. I rabbit hole research because I want to know every single detail. So when I read this, I wasn't just focused on the miracle. I started noticing these details, the things that Luke decided to say. He doesn't just say that Jesus healed her. He says that she had been like that for 18 years. That was apparently important to Luke. Then he says that Jesus saw her. Then he says that he called her forward. And then he also mentions that he touched her. And I sat here thinking, Luke, why are you telling me all of this? The miracle was going to happen anyway, but the more that I thought about it, I realized maybe the details are the story. I stopped thinking just about the miracle and I started thinking about the woman herself. And I had to ask myself, what have I gotten used to carrying that I was never meant to? Because that's exactly what she was doing. She was carrying this sickness for 18 years that Satan had bound her with. And I don't think that she was really ever meant to carry it. 18 years, think about that. That's a really long time. Life moves on, people grow up, friends change, things happen. I mean, kids graduate high school in 18 years. And all that time, she was still bent over. So I started wondering, not just about the Sabbath, because that's really in church, that's the stories that I have. That's how this verse or this passage has always been preached, is that Jesus healed on the Sabbath and talking about untying the donkeys or the ox and whatever. I don't think that I've ever really heard anybody preach on the actual woman or on the miracle. And so I started thinking about what a normal day looked like for her. Like, what does a Tuesday look like? What dreams slipped away from her in those 18 years? What prayers did she stop praying because she didn't think that things could change for her? What did she accept as, well, that's just my life now? And I think that's where this story started getting personal for me, because I get that, because I know what it's like to slowly adapt to something. After Reese passed away, I wasn't just grieving. Normally, I'm a person that talks to everybody. I love a good conversation. I chat with someone in line just for the fun of it, but for a while, that part of me just faded. Going out and talking to people, it was just really exhausting. Sometimes it still is, but especially in that part of my life. I just wanted to be at home and on my couch and left alone. And the weird part is, I didn't even really notice it in myself at first. It wasn't like one day I just decided to withdraw. Life for me just shrank. One day it hit me. My life had started revolving around avoiding things, avoiding conversations, avoiding things that took energy that I didn't have. And yeah, I had a lot of guilt mixed in there over the circumstances and things that happened. And I'm not going to get into that today, but I carried stuff that was mine to carry, and I also carried stuff that wasn't. And looking back, I think part of me felt that I didn't deserve to be happy anymore. I wouldn't have said that out loud then, but I can see it now. Little by little, I stopped doing things that I enjoyed, and I stopped looking forward to stuff. And I think that's how we adapt to things like that. Not all at once, but little by little, until one day you look in the mirror and you think, wait, is this even me? And maybe that's why I keep thinking about this woman after 18 years. I wonder, did that just become her normal? Just to wake up, just to be staring at the ground? I'm sure she was in pain. That, our bodies are not formed to be bent over that way. So I'm sure she just adapted to the pain. And it makes me think of times when even getting out of bed felt hard for me. If I had to face something like that daily, would I be able to keep showing up? You know, I'm talking about things like my mental health, and a lot of times, those are silent and you can mask those. But she had a physical deformity, something that couldn't be masked. Everybody saw it. And that kind of reminded me of my Aunt Tina when she found out that she needed a colostomy bag. I went to her appointment with her that day, and they told her that she was going to have surgery and have the rest of her colon removed, and that she would have a colostomy. And she was terrified. And I don't think that she was actually like terrified because of the surgery itself, because at that point she'd already had several surgeries. I think she was terrified at what she thought her life would look like. I don't think that she thought it would ever feel normal again. She was worried about how others would see her, um, having to go out in public with a literal bag of poop attached to the outside of your body. I mean, that's like humiliating. But she probably is the strongest fighter that I've ever known in my entire life. And people tell me all the time how strong I am, and I can tell you with 100% certainty that I got it from her. I learned it from her. It was mimicked from her, because she persevered and she kept going and she kept living her best life until her very last breath. But that's why I relate, because how do you live with something for so long and still continue to show up? And yet, after all of those years, she was in the synagogue when Jesus walked in. I've had days where showing up was the hardest part of my day. And I wonder how many times that she hoped maybe today and walked out of that synagogue still the same. We don't really know all the details, but we know that she was there. And if she hadn't been there that day, the story would be very different. The story wouldn't exist, because Jesus didn't find her at home after giving up. He found her still showing up. And it makes me think maybe faith is showing up when you're tired, when nothing changes, just continuing to show up. After 18 years, she was there, and that's when her story changed. Not because she found Jesus, but because Jesus saw her. And I think that part is one of my favorite parts. When verse 12 says, when Jesus saw her, I've read that many times, and every time I pause there, because I don't imagine an empty room. I picture people everywhere, some eager, some distracted, some thinking about lunch, just a typical day. I wonder what her morning was like before she got there. Was she on her way and expecting something to be different? Or did those 18 years of nothing changing teach her not to expect much at all? We don't know. Jesus just tells us, or not Jesus, Luke just tells us that she was there. She wasn't trying to get attention. She just kept showing up. And in that ordinary day, in a crowd full of people, Jesus saw her. And that hits me, maybe because I've had days where I was there in body but not in spirit, smiling and saying, I'm fine, when I wasn't fine. But that's why I love that verse, because she wasn't extraordinary. She just showed up, and Jesus saw her anyways, and that's comforting to me. There's been parts of my life where I couldn't chase after anything at all. I was just making it through the day. But I think she reminds me that Jesus doesn't have trouble finding us, even when all we have the ability to do is just show up. And then the next part I think is really cool, because Jesus didn't wait. He was in the middle of teaching. He's in the middle of a synagogue. Again, all these people gathered around him, the synagogue rulers, religious people there, all huddled around him. And in this crowd, he spots her, and it says that he saw her, but he stopped. He interrupted his teaching, the divine word of God. And I don't even know how to express like how prominent or how important that is, that he felt that she was important enough to stop his teaching to this huge crowd of people on the Sabbath day and to call her forward. But he did. He called her forward. And I can't help but wonder what must have been going through her mind at that moment. Luke tells us that she'd been bound by Satan for 18 years. And in that culture back then, people didn't usually separate physical suffering from someone's spiritual life. If someone was sick, people often assumed there had to be a reason. Maybe it was sin, maybe it was judgment, maybe something was wrong with them spiritually. We see that mindset all throughout the Gospels. So I can't help but wonder what people had been saying about her for the last 18 years. What assumptions had they made? What conclusions had they come to before they ever even knew her story? Because we all know this, but words have a way of doing something to us. People say the saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And that, I've never believed that. Some of our deepest wounds people carry weren't caused by something that happened to them. They were caused by something someone said to them or said about them. And the scary part is, if you hear something long enough, eventually you stop questioning it. You just accept it. You start seeing yourself through the same lens that everybody else has been looking through. And I have to wonder if that happened to her. I'm sure it did. After 18 years, had she stopped seeing herself as a daughter and started seeing herself as nothing more than the bent over woman? Because that's exactly what Satan wants. He doesn't just want to bind our bodies. He wants to bind our mind and our identity too. So when Jesus called her forward, I don't just see a woman taking a few steps across the synagogue. I see someone who spent 18 years listening to the wrong voices, finally walking towards the only voice that had the authority to tell her who she really was. And the obedience that it took for her to walk towards the center of that synagogue, I mean, I think that's a whole lesson in itself. And maybe we'll talk about that next week, because that's way too, that simple step forward, that's a lot. Many scholars teach that women sat separately in the synagogue and weren't allowed in the center. They weren't permitted to speak or take focus. They were to be seen, not heard. And yet Jesus calls this woman right to the center of the synagogue. The woman who'd been looking down for 18 years, looking at the dirt, looking at people's shoes, is now looking at Jesus. The one who was on the edges is now in the middle of the story. And that's what Jesus does. He takes those whom society overlooks and he reminds them that they were never overlooked by him. And as I sat with this story, I realized this wasn't just about healing. Sure, he did heal her, but he restored something too, because people saw her condition for a very, very long time. Not her story, just her condition. And now they were about to see her value. Jesus calls her a daughter of Abraham, and it's easy to miss, but that's huge. He could have called her by what others saw, but he didn't. He called her a daughter. And I wonder, when was the last time that someone called her that, with that endearment? So this part really hits me. Jesus says, "Woman, you were loosed from your infirmity." Basically, he's saying, you're free. But in that moment, she's still bent over. Nothing looks different yet. And that got me thinking, sometimes Jesus speaks freedom before anyone else can see it. Usually we want proof first, right? But he speaks based on what he knows. And it made me wonder, how often does God speak something over my life and I'm so stuck on my circumstances that I can't see it? She still looks bound at that moment. She's still bent over, but he had just called her free. And I don't think that he's ignoring her condition. I think that he was speaking to something bigger, speaking to who she was becoming. And I think that's just so great, because it's not just about the physical stuff. Sometimes you're bent over is a family situation or issues with your kids. Sometimes it's finances, like how are we going to pay this bill? Or times for me, when I didn't know how I was going to go on after Reese went to be with Jesus, that's how I delivered this message before. I was literally so bent over and so overcome with depression that I literally couldn't plan out my next 10 minutes. But God doesn't just see us for those moments. He already knows how it's going to work out. He already has the plans for us. Even when we can't see it, he speaks to the other side of it. We spend so much time staring at what's wrong that eventually that's all that we can see. And then Jesus says something completely different. Not because he doesn't see the pain that we are experiencing, but because he also sees the person that's underneath it. And that's why I love what happens next, because this story takes yet another turn. Because Jesus lays his hands on her. And that is the part that made me stop. Because why? Why did he lay his hands on her? He had already told her that she was free. If his words had authority to set her free, and they did, then why did Luke make sure to tell us that Jesus touched her too? Again, details. I've been thinking about this the entire time that I'm reading it. Details, details, details. Because Jesus didn't have to touch her. He could have spoken the miracle from across the room where she stood before. He didn't have to call her forward. We've already seen him do things like that. So why this time? I don't really know for sure, and Luke doesn't tell us, but I wonder if it's because Jesus wasn't just interested in freeing her. I wonder if he wanted her to know that she didn't have to keep living at a distance anymore. After 18 years of carrying something everybody else could see, after 18 years of living with all of the assumptions that people made about her, Jesus didn't hesitate. He got close to her, he touched her, and then she stood straight up. And I love the order of that. He speaks, he touches, she stands. And Luke says the first thing that she did was glorify God. And honestly, I don't think that is a coincidence either. If I'd spent 18 years wondering whether God had forgotten me, and then Jesus stops everything that he has going on, the divine word of God that he is preaching, to see me, to call me forward, to speak to me, and then to touch me, I think worship would have been my first response too. A woman who spent 18 years staring at the dirt could now see the sun, the literal sun, and not just the physical sun, but the Son of God. She was literally staring into the eyes of Jesus. Can you imagine how she must have felt? What the room must have felt like? The excitement, the celebration, the shock of watching something happen that nobody expected when they walked into the synagogue that morning. I mean, they literally witnessed a miracle. And then the ruler of the synagogue starts talking. Every time I get to this part, I kind of just shake my head because I can't imagine witnessing a miracle like that and seeing that kind of excitement and immediately being upset about what day of the week it happened on. A woman who has spent 18 years bent over is suddenly standing straight in front of you. She's standing straight up. You've seen her in the synagogue every week, bent over for 18 years, and now she's standing straight up in front of you, and somehow the conversation turns into Sabbath rules. But the older I get, or maybe just the wiser I get, the less interested I am in criticizing this ruler, because the more I find myself wondering if I would have noticed what Jesus was doing either. Sometimes we like to make judgments about things when we don't really know how we would react, because sometimes we get so locked into our expectations that we ourselves miss that God is working right in front of us. Sometimes we're looking for him to answer one prayer while he's already moving somewhere we haven't even been paying attention. The ruler immediately saw a violation because that was his job, but Jesus saw a woman, and I've thought about that sentence a lot. Then Jesus says something that completely changed the way that I read the story as he's chastising this ruler. He calls this woman a daughter of Abraham. And the first time I studied this passage, I almost read right past it. Now it is literally my favorite part because we don't know this woman's name. Luke doesn't tell us. For 2,000 years, we've only known her by her condition, the bent over woman. That's how she's introduced. That's how she's remembered. But Jesus doesn't introduce her that way. And I couldn't quit thinking about that because if anybody in that synagogue knew her name, it was Jesus. He knew everything about her. He knew her story. He knew every tear that she'd ever cried over those 18 years. He knew every prayer that she prayed. I mean, he created her. He knew exactly what those 18 years had cost her. And yet he doesn't call her by her name. He doesn't call her by her condition. He calls her by her lineage. He calls her a daughter of Abraham. Think about that. Out of every way that Jesus could have identified her in that moment, he chose to remind everyone who she belonged to. Not what had happened to her or what she carried, not what everybody else saw when they looked at her. He reminded them of her identity. And I think that's beautiful because life has a way of introducing us by our wounds. Grief, addiction, anxiety, divorce, shame, failure, whatever it is, if we're not careful, those things get so loud that eventually they start sounding like our identity. And this woman had spent 18 years being known for her infirmity. Jesus had spent 18 years seeing a daughter. And that literally hits me between the eyes because there have been times in my life where I was carrying became so much louder than who I was, not just to other people, but to me. Even today, like I have to remind myself as I go through struggles and trials, this is not who I am. When people say horrible, bad things about me that are untrue or make assumptions about my life or the work or the things that we do, because it happens, I have to remind myself that that's not me, that I am a daughter of Abraham. And those things are so much more important than the way that Jesus sees me is so much more important than the way the rest of the world sees me. Especially how I still deal with guilt and grief today, and there was a time in my life where my grief felt louder than my grace and my guilt felt louder than my truth. And even today, the labels sometimes feel louder than the promises that God says that I have, the promises of God. And maybe that's why God wouldn't let me leave Luke 13 alone, why he kept bringing me back to it. I thought he kept bringing it back because there was something that he wanted to say to somebody else. Like I said, initially, I was thinking about these Christway women, Christway Ministries women, and I hope that they're listening to this, and I hope that they can see this too, because they are also daughters of Abraham, and I hope that they can restore their identity, because I know that they, like this woman, have struggled with the things that people say, and even internal struggles with this is just who I am, and but now I wonder if there was something that he needed to remind me of too. Before he reminded me of what he could do, he had to remind me of who I was, who I am. And I wonder if that's why remembering who we are matters so much. Because if we forget who God says we are, we'll spend our entire lives believing we're disqualified from the very things that He'll eventually ask us to do. Like this podcast, I don't feel qualified to do this. I'm only doing it out of obedience. And honestly, I keep putting it off and I keep putting it off because I have that feeling of unqualification. You're not a good enough talker. People don't care what you have to say. I mean, that's the things that Satan sitting here is telling you in your ear. But God says, you are a daughter of Abraham. And He knows what we're qualified for. He knows our qualifications just like He knew this woman's qualifications. He made us. He knows everything about us. And anyways, that's what I learned through this. And maybe that's where some of you are today, not questioning whether God is able, but quietly questioning whether He could ever use somebody like you, whether He could ever use somebody like me. And I think we'll save that conversation for another day. But for today, I think this woman is reminding us of something we all needed to hear. Before she ever stood up straight, Jesus called her a daughter. I've thought about this woman a lot over the last several months, and it's not because of the miracle that was performed on her or because of the controversy around it. It's because that she walked into the synagogue and she was carrying something that had been a part of her life for so long, for 18 years, and somewhere in the middle of an ordinary Sabbath service, Jesus reminded her who she is, a daughter, because life has a way of piling things on top of us. Questions we can't answer, prayers that haven't been answered the way that we hoped they would. And if we're not careful, those things get so loud that we start believing that they are the truest things about us. Jesus has something different to say. He always has. So wherever that this finds you today, I hope you'll remember what the bent over woman learned that day. What I've learned through reading this again, that we are not what we've been carrying. You are not the hardest thing that you've lived through. You are not the label that somebody else has placed on you, and you are certainly not forgotten. Before Jesus ever straightened her back, He reminded her of who she was. He restored her identity. And I don't think that was an accident. I think that's exactly how He works. I think that was His plan all along. So thanks for sitting with me today. And if you've forgotten who you are, if what you're carrying has gotten louder than what God has spoken, if you've started believing the label instead of God's promises, maybe it's time to ask Him again. Not because He's forgotten what He said, but because sometimes life can get so loud that we just need to hear it again. Just a simple, say it again, Lord.